I woke up before sunrise to the low, angry growl of diesel engines shaking my bedroom walls. For half a second, I thought it was a city plow clearing the street after the storm. Then the sound stopped. Right in front of my house. I looked out the window just as a dump truck lifted its bed and dumped a solid wave of filthy, compacted snow straight onto my driveway. Not fresh snow. This was dark, oily salt, burned sludge scraped from roads and parking lots. It slammed down so hard it snapped my mailbox post clean in half. Standing on the sidewalk like this was a private joke was Karen Whitmore, the HOA head of Ridgefield Glen. Designer coat. Phone held up. Smiling while she filmed every second. She looked right at me and yelled, "This is what happens when you don't follow community standards." Within minutes, my driveway was gone. My garage doors were sealed shut. My auto restoration shop, the only way I paid my bills, was trapped behind a frozen wall I never asked for and couldn't legally move. What Karen didn't realize was that she hadn't just broken an HOA rule. She had broken city law, environmental law, and emergency easement regulations. And she had done it all on camera. The snow she dumped on me wasn't my punishment. It was her evidence. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I moved to Ridgefield Glen because I was tired of noise, chaos, and people telling me how to live. After my divorce, I wanted quiet mornings, long evenings in my garage, and enough space to focus on rebuilding old cars the right way. The house wasn't fancy. One story, faded siding. But it came with a large detached garage, and that was everything to me. Restoring classic cars wasn't a hobby. It was how I paid my bills. Everything was legal, proper zoning, county permits, annual inspections. I made sure of that before I ever signed the paperwork. I didn't even finish unpacking before Karen Whitmore noticed me. She didn't walk over with cookies or a welcome packet. She stood at the end of my driveway with a clipboard, sunglasses on, watching me unload tools like she was assessing a crime scene. When she finally spoke, it wasn't a greeting, it was a warning. "I'm the HOA head," she said. "We like to keep things orderly here." I nodded, smiled, and went back to work. That was my first mistake. Karen didn't like being ignored. Within the first 2 weeks, she started circling. I'd catch her parked across the street, phone raised, taking pictures of my garage. She timed when engines started, even though I never worked outside permitted hours. She'd casually remind me that Ridgefield Glen was a quiet, upscale community, emphasizing the word quiet like it was a threat. When I showed her my permits, she barely glanced at them. "We'll see," she said, smiling in a way that made my stomach tighten. The letters started arriving not long after, official-looking envelopes, HOA letterhead, polite but sharp language, noise warnings for days I hadn't even turned an engine on, vehicle storage violations for cars that were fully registered and actively being restored, notes claiming neighbors were concerned, even though no one ever spoke to me directly. Then came the anonymous reports to code enforcement. City inspectors showed up more than once. Each time they found nothing wrong. Each time Karen stood at a distance watching, arms crossed, annoyed that reality refused to cooperate. Most people would have backed down right there. I thought about it. Selling crossed my mind more than once. But every time I reviewed the rules, the zoning maps, the permits, I knew I wasn't wrong. And that seemed to drive her insane. It took me a while to understand what the real problem was. It wasn't the noise. It wasn't the cars. It was where my house sat. My property was on a corner lot at the edge of the neighborhood, right next to a municipal snow easement. It wasn't pretty land, just a strip the city used during heavy winters to temporarily store snow so the roads stayed passable. It existed long before the HOA did, and it was protected by city ordinance. Karen controlled the HOA roads. She controlled landscaping rules, parking warnings, petty fines. But she didn't control that easement. She couldn't regulate it. She couldn't fine it. She couldn't pretend it belonged to the HOA, and that lack of control ate at her. I noticed she avoided standing near that side of my property. When she did, she'd glance toward it with open irritation, like the land itself was mocking her. Once she muttered, "That should have been HOA land," under her breath. That was when it clicked. Karen didn't see Ridgefield Glen as a neighborhood. She saw it as territory, and my house sat on land she couldn't dominate. The letters increased after that. More warnings. More vague threats about future enforcement. She tried to push a vote through the board to restrict commercial activity, even though county law overruled HOA rules. The motion failed, and I could tell that embarrassed her. Neighbors started keeping their distance. A few looked apologetic. One older woman finally pulled me aside and whispered that Karen had run off other homeowners before. Not with snow, with pressure. Endless paperwork. Selective enforcement, making life so uncomfortable that people gave up. That was her system. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She squeezed. Slowly, quietly, until people broke. I didn't know it then, but she had already decided how to deal with me. She was just waiting for winter. Over the next several months, Karen escalated without ever raising her voice. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She buried me in paper and smiled while she did it. Every week, sometimes twice a week, a new violation notice appeared in my mailbox. The language was always careful and vague. Excessive mechanical noise. Improper vehicle storage. Commercial activity inconsistent with community standards. None of it cited specific dates. None of it referenced actual HOA bylaws. It was all just threatening enough to make you nervous, especially if you didn't know your rights. I started keeping a folder. At first, it was just to stay organized. One envelope became two became 10. Before long, I had a thick stack of notices that all said the same thing in slightly different words. I compared them against my permits, my zoning approvals, and the HOA rules. Every single accusation fell apart the moment it touched reality. That didn't stop her. Karen tried to find me next. She pushed it onto the HOA agenda as a routine enforcement matter, hoping it would pass without discussion. It didn't. A couple of board members asked questions. I was invited to speak. I brought copies of my permits. The vote failed. Karen's smile that night was tight and cold. A week later, she tried something else. I came home to find orange cones partially blocking my driveway, placed just far enough to make turning difficult. A notice was taped to my garage door claiming temporary access restrictions for community safety. I checked the maps. The driveway was fully mine, and the road easement didn't give the HOA any authority to block it. I moved the cones. They never came back. After that, Karen started showing up in person. She'd appear near my fence line without notice, clipboard in hand, pretending to inspect common areas that just happened to be adjacent to my property. She took photos of my yard from strange angles. She measured distances that didn't matter. Once, I caught her peering into my open garage, phone raised. When I asked her what she was doing, she said, "Just documenting." That word followed me everywhere after that. Documenting. She documented when my lights were on. She documented when deliveries arrived. She documented how long my garage door stayed open. It felt less like an HOA issue and more like surveillance. Neighbors noticed too. At first, they were friendly. Curious, a few asked about the cars I was working on. But as Karen's pressure increased, people pulled away. Conversations ended faster. Waves became nods. Nod became nothing. Nobody wanted to be seen siding with the person Karen was targeting. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, An older woman approached me slowly, glancing over her shoulder before she spoke. Her name was Martha Ellison. She lived 3 houses down and walked with a cane. "I just wanted you to know," she said quietly. "You're not imagining this." I told her I figured I wasn't. She nodded. "She's done it before. Not like this, but similar. Landscaping violations, paint colors, parking rules that suddenly mattered. People get tired, they sell. That stuck with me. I started sleeping lighter, listening for engines, checking my mailbox with a knot in my stomach. Even though I knew I was in the right, the constant pressure wore me down. That was the point. Karen wasn't trying to win an argument. She was trying to exhaust me. I considered selling. I ran the numbers more than once. What I'd lose, what I'd gain, how much peace was worth. Some nights, standing alone in my garage, I wondered if it was smarter to walk away. But every time I came close, something stopped me. Mostly, it was the tone of her letters, the certainty, the assumption that she would eventually break me. That confidence irritated me more than the harassment itself, so I adjusted. I installed additional cameras. I logged every interaction. I saved every message. I started reading municipal codes in the evenings, not because I planned to fight yet, but because I wanted to understand the terrain. That's when I noticed the pattern. Karen wasn't improvising. She was waiting. Her complaints slowed as fall turned into winter. Fewer letters, fewer appearances. For the first time since I moved in, things went quiet, too quiet. The first heavy snowfall came early that year. Streets buried, plows running nonstop. The municipal snow easement beside my property filled up fast, just like it always did. I remember standing by the window, watching the snow pile higher, and thinking that winter might finally give me a break. I was wrong. Winter wasn't a pause. It was her opportunity. And when Karen made her move, she didn't do it with paper. She did it with trucks. The storm that finally broke everything wasn't just bad. It was historic. Snow fell nonstop for 2 full days, thick and heavy, the kind that bends street signs and buries cars up to their mirrors. The city issued emergency declarations. Plows ran around the clock. The municipal snow easement beside my property filled exactly the way it was designed to, rising into a long, controlled ridge of packed white. That morning, I woke to engines again. But this time, it wasn't the city. I looked out my window and immediately knew something was wrong. The trucks outside my house weren't marked municipal vehicles. No city logos, no flashing beacons. These were commercial landscaping trucks, tall, lifted, dirty from long nights of hauling snow. I recognized the name on the doors instantly. It was the same company listed as my HOA's preferred contractor, Karen's husband's company. I threw on a jacket and stepped outside just as the first truck reversed toward my driveway. Before I could say a word, the bed tilted. Snow poured out in a thick, violent rush, slamming into my driveway like wet concrete. This wasn't fresh snow. It was dark and compacted, streaked with oil and road grime. Chunks of ice bounced against my garage door. The weight snapped my mailbox post clean in half. I shouted for them to stop. They didn't. Karen stood on the sidewalk a few yards away, phone held up, filming like she was capturing a vacation moment. She laughed when she saw me and gestured for the driver to dump the rest. "More right there," she said, pointing. Another truck pulled up. Then another. Each one added to the wall growing in front of my driveway, sealing it off completely. Within minutes, my garage doors were buried. The entrance to my shop, my only source of income, disappeared behind a frozen barricade I hadn't asked for and couldn't legally touch. When I demanded an explanation, Karen finally looked at me, her smile sharp and satisfied. "This is what happens when you don't follow community standards," she said. "You'll pay for removal." I told her she couldn't do this, that it wasn't OA property, that the snow was contaminated. She waved me off and pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat. "I already invoiced you," she said casually. "You requested the service." I stared at the document. My name was on it, my address, a forged signature, a fake work order claiming I had hired her husband's company to dump snow on my own driveway. That was the moment everything changed. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This wasn't HOA overreach. This was fraud. I didn't touch the snow. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten her. I walked back inside and pulled up my camera feeds. Every truck, every dump, every license plate. Karen laughing. Karen directing. Karen filming herself committing a crime. I backed everything up twice. While she stood there celebrating, convinced she'd finally broken me, she didn't realize she had crossed out of HOA territory and straight into city, environmental, and criminal law. And she had handed me the proof. Winter hadn't trapped me. Karen had trapped herself. I didn't touch the snow, not a shovel, not a plow, not even a kick at the edges. Instead, I treated it like a crime scene. I photographed everything from every angle, wide shots, close-ups, tire treads, oil streaks frozen into the surface. I recorded video walkthroughs with time stamps, narrating what had been dumped, where it came from, and how it blocked access to my driveway and garage. I zoomed in on license plates, company logos, the exact moment each truck crossed from the road onto my property. I backed everything up twice and stored copies off-site. Only then did I call the city. The next morning, Inspector Daniel Ruiz pulled up in an unmarked vehicle and stood quietly at the edge of my driveway, staring at the frozen mass in front of him. He didn't say much at first. He crouched, scraped a gloved hand across the surface, and sniffed the residue. "This isn't residential snow," he said finally. He pointed out the oil sheen, the road salt concentration, the embedded debris. Snow like this wasn't allowed to be relocated onto private property, especially not next to a municipal easement. It posed contamination risks, drainage risks, environmental risks. He asked who dumped it. I showed him the footage. He didn't smile. "This is illegal relocation," he said. "Intentional." Then he started walking the perimeter. That's when we found it. Karen's fence line didn't quite line up with the survey markers. Neither did her decorative garden wall. Her storage shed sat just far enough back to look harmless, unless you checked the city plats. Inspector Ruiz pulled up the maps on his tablet. Part of her property improvements weren't on her property at all. They crossed onto mine. Worse than that, they crossed into an emergency drainage easement that ran behind both our lots. An easement designed to prevent flooding during heavy snowmelt. She hadn't just dumped snow illegally. She'd been blocking a critical drainage corridor for years. Inspector Ruiz documented everything. Measurements, photos, notes. He flagged it for environmental review and forwarded it to the city engineer's office. I didn't stop there. I filed reports the same way Karen had tried to bury me, methodically. One complaint led to the next: illegal dumping, environmental contamination, fraudulent invoicing, easement obstruction. Each report referenced the others. Each one strengthened the case. Karen noticed. 2 days later, another truck arrived. More snow. This time from a commercial parking lot across town. Darker, dirtier, heavier. Dumped higher and tighter against my garage doors, like she was daring me to react. I didn't. I filmed. She was panicking now, even if she didn't realize it. Her actions were faster, sloppier, less thought out. She left voicemails that contradicted her paperwork. She sent emails threatening fines she no longer had authority to issue. I saved everything. City officials returned, this time with environmental specialists. They took samples. They tested runoff paths. They confirmed what Inspector Ruiz had already suspected. That snow couldn't stay where it was. But here was the problem. I wasn't allowed to remove it. Legally, I couldn't touch it. Not until the city decided what to do with contaminated material dumped onto a regulated easement, adjacent property. Karen had assumed I'd panic and pay for removal. Instead, she had frozen herself into a legal corner. She tried to spin the story. She sent messages claiming I had staged the dumping, that I was running an unlicensed operation, that the HOA had acted to protect the community. None of it matched the footage. None of it matched the invoices. None of it matched the law. Every time she escalated, the paper trail grew thicker. By the end of the week, I had a binder full of documentation and multiple city departments quietly coordinating behind the scenes. Environmental services, engineering, code enforcement. Karen kept dumping snow, convinced that burying the problem would make it go away. She didn't understand that every new load made the consequences worse. What she saw as pressure was becoming evidence. What she thought was control was turning into exposure, and the frozen wall in front of my driveway, it wasn't trapping me anymore. It was waiting for the city to decide where it legally belonged. And when that decision came, Karen was not going to like where the snow ended up. Karen called it an emergency meeting. The notice went out less than 24 hours in advance, flagged as urgent, with language that made it sound like I had endangered the entire neighborhood. Words like hazard, liability, and immediate action required were bolded more than once. By the time I walked into the community center that evening, the room was already packed. Every folding chair was filled. People lined the walls. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact for months suddenly couldn't stop staring. Karen stood at the front of the room, perfectly composed, clipboard in hand. She looked confident, relieved even, like this was the moment she'd been waiting for. She started talking before anyone else could. She described the snow in front of my driveway as reckless, dangerous, a threat to emergency access. She claimed she had acted to protect the community and accused me of refusing to remove hazardous material from my own property. She never mentioned who put it there. She never mentioned the trucks. When she finished, she folded her hands and looked around the room like the matter was settled. That's when I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I walked to the front with a small folder and asked if I could respond. A few board members nodded, unsure but curious. I connected my laptop to the projector. The first video played without commentary, a dump truck reversing into my driveway, the bed lifting, dirty snow crashing down, Karen's voice clearly audible in the background, laughing, telling the driver where to dump the next load. Murmurs spread through the room. I let the next clip roll, a second truck, then a third, close-ups of license plates, timestamps. Karen standing on the sidewalk filming herself. I paused the video and held up a single sheet of paper. The invoice. The forged work order claiming I had requested the dumping. I explained, calmly, that I had never hired that company, never signed that document, and never authorized anyone to dump snow on my property. I pointed out the mismatched signature and incorrect contact information. Then I handed out copies of the city inspection reports, illegal snow relocation, environmental contamination, trespass, fraud. The room went silent. No coughing. No whispers, just the hum of the projector and the sound of Karen breathing faster. One of the board members, Elaine Carter, finally spoke. She was a retired accountant, known for being careful and quiet. She asked Karen a simple question. Why were HOA funds used to pay a private contractor to dump snow onto a homeowner's driveway? Karen's head snapped toward her. That's not what happened, she said quickly. He requested it. Elaine lifted the invoice copy. Then why does this document list the HOA account number for payment? Karen's composure cracked. She started talking faster, interrupting, accusing me of manipulation, claiming the footage was misleading. She said, The HOA had authority to act in emergencies. She said the city reports were opinions. She didn't realize she was digging deeper. Another board member asked why the contractor belonged to her husband. Karen snapped back that it was irrelevant. Someone in the back laughed, nervously, loud enough to be heard. The room shifted. Karen had always controlled these meetings through confidence and volume. But this time, she had evidence stacked against her, and the more she spoke, the worse it sounded. Elaine called for a procedural vote. The motion wasn't about guilt. It wasn't about punishment. It was about authority. Specifically, whether Karen should retain emergency enforcement powers while multiple city investigations were active. The vote passed. Just like that, Karen lost the ability to issue violations, authorize contractors, or act unilaterally on behalf of the HOA. Her face went pale. She gathered her papers too quickly, knocking one onto the floor. When she bent to pick it up, I heard her whisper to someone sitting in the front row. Plan B. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it chilled the room, because at that moment I knew something important. Karen hadn't learned anything. She hadn't understood the danger she was in. And whatever she planned to do next wasn't going to fix her situation. It was going to end it. Karen had pushed too far this time. The snow, stolen from the city's emergency reserve, wasn't just a petty prank anymore. It was an environmental violation, and that meant automatic triggers. Natalie Brooks, the city engineer, spotted it immediately. The drainage corridor behind Karen's house was blocked, a textbook hazard waiting to happen. The city didn't negotiate. They acted. By dawn, crews rolled in with heavy machinery. Snow that had once been her weapon became her trap. Bulldozers carved through the piles, sending the mass onto public land exactly where regulations dictated. 12 feet of compressed, icy authority. A literal legal barricade planted in front of her driveway. She couldn't move it. No threats of fines, no HOA letters could undo it. Cars were buried. Tires spun helplessly against the frozen wall. Trucks meant for errands, for work, for life, were immobilized. She stomped in the cold, furious, trying to dig through with shovels and garden tools. It was futile. The law had built her prison, and it was immovable. Even her landscaping didn't survive. The ornamental bushes she'd bragged about to neighbors flattened beneath the weight of legality. The flowers she'd planted for aesthetic dominance crushed under the snow's authority. Nature, bureaucracy, and public ordinance had teamed against her, and there was no appeal. Karen's neighbors watched from behind curtains and frosted windows, their satisfaction quiet but palpable. The smug smiles she had once worn like armor were gone. Her power had evaporated faster than the snow in spring. All her threats, her manipulations, her fake warnings about violations she'd tried to enforce on others, bounced back on her. Authority, Karen discovered, is fragile when built on theft and arrogance. Calls to her HOA head were ignored. Calls to city officials were met with procedural politeness but no leniency. Even the local attorney she tried to bribe or charm couldn't touch the wall. The legal snow wall wasn't just snow, it was evidence, enforcement, and spectacle rolled into one. Every inch of it was a reminder. When you cross boundaries, the consequences are absolute. By noon, she gave up. She left the house, trudging down the street to visit neighbors, trying to salvage what dignity she could. They nodded curtly, some whispering to each other, some openly laughing. Karen's usual shrill arguments for control had no audience. Her domain, which she had wielded with such arrogance, was now public land in front of her own driveway. She was powerless in plain sight. Even the HOA felt the shift. Members who once deferred to her now hesitated. Board leaders muttered about policy reviews and liability exposure. Her reign of intimidation had crumbled without a single direct confrontation. Legal authority, public oversight, and environmental regulation had done what no neighborly complaint ever could. By evening, Karen stared out at the snow wall from inside her home, frozen coffee in hand. It gleamed in the waning light, a monument to consequences. She tried once more to plan her escape, her clever manipulation, a way to reclaim dominance, but the law had already sealed her fate. Each inch of that snow was a victory for accountability, a reminder that shortcuts, theft, and arrogance eventually meet immovable resistance. Neighbors drove past cautiously, trucks sidestepping the icy barricade, but always with a glance at her house. Children skated on the sidewalk where snow had once fallen unchecked. Even the mail carrier altered their route slightly, a small symbolic nod to order over chaos. Karen's frustration was the soundtrack to the neighborhood's quiet vindication. The legal snow wall stood firm for days. Karen tried to hire crews, shovels, private contractors, even friends, but every attempt required permits, approvals, and insurance. The bureaucracy was deliberate, precise, immovable. She realized, perhaps too late, that her own schemes had created a chain reaction she could never outrun. By the time the city finally cleared the snow, on its timetable, under its rules, Karen's authority had already melted away. The HOA, the neighbors, even herself, had learned a lesson: control isn't about aggression. It's about compliance, legality, and respect for boundaries. Karen's empire of intimidation had been frozen in place, and only time and accountability thawed it. In the aftermath, her house became a cautionary tale, a 12-foot reminder that no matter how loud, how manipulative, how authoritative someone thinks they are, law and procedure have the final say. Karen's power wasn't gone in a day. It had been dismantled piece by piece, layer by layer, like the snow that now lay obediently where it belonged. By sunset, she retreated inside. Her driveway remained a subtle monument to lessons learned the hard way. Outside, the neighborhood returned to quiet order. The legal snow wall had done more than trap vehicles. It had trapped arrogance, frozen it in plain sight, and reminded everyone watching that when you break the rules will break you. This wasn't just a snow wall. It was justice, immovable, undeniable, and perfectly legal. Karen's unraveling was spectacular, and everyone in Ridgefield Glen got a front row seat. What had started as a petty escalation snowballed into chaos, and Karen's ego couldn't handle being sidelined. She decided to fight back in her own ingenious way, live streaming herself trying to remove the 12-foot legal snow wall that had humiliated her for days. Her fingers fumbled on her phone as she narrated her struggle, unaware that her broadcast would become the centerpiece of her undoing. She built a makeshift ramp out of planks and cinder blocks, positioning it precariously against the icy barricade. Her attempts were clumsy and dangerous. Shovel slid, snow collapsed in chunks. Onlookers passing by slowed to watch the spectacle, some recording on their phones, others shaking their heads. Karen shouted orders at imagined helpers and muttered curses at her driveway. Every flailing move was being captured for posterity, every mistake amplified by her own live stream. Then came the fateful decision: bribing a city official. Karen approached him with cash tucked inside a folder, promising to resolve the situation quietly. Unbeknownst to her, the official was wearing a wire. The conversation was recorded in full. Investigators later described it as the smoking gun, proof of intent to circumvent law and procedure. That single moment sealed her fate far faster than any snow wall could have. Minutes later, sirens screamed down the cold sack. Investigators poured out of unmarked vehicles. Search warrants were executed at her home and her husband's office. Cameras from local news affiliates arrived, capturing Karen mid-ramp collapse, phone still clutched in hand, snow cascading around her like the final act in a slow-motion catastrophe. The visual was perfect. The queen of intimidation reduced to scrambling on ice in front of her neighbors and a growing media swarm. By noon, she was handcuffed. The 12-foot legal snow wall stood behind her, a monument to both her hubris and the relentless, quiet power of law. News crews framed her against it. Highlighting the irony, the barricade she had tried to destroy became the backdrop for her arrest. Residents of Ridgefield Glen watched in stunned silence, some cheering quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Karen's husband, who had long thrived off her influence and local contracts, saw his business collapse almost immediately. Clients pulled out. Vendors demanded payment. The reputation of association with Karen's tactics had become toxic overnight. Meetings that had once hummed with HOA gossip and whispered threats now focused on stability and recovery. The HOA itself was thrown into receivership, its board members suddenly accountable, its funds frozen and audited, and its authority over the community reduced to whispers of what once was. The street that had echoed with Karen's shrill commands and the groaning of snow clearing machinery was now eerily quiet. Children played again on cleared sidewalks. Neighbors who had tiptoed past her house or avoided eye contact for months now returned to normal routines, cautiously savoring a peace they hadn't known in years. The sound of the legal snow wall, or rather, the absence of it, became the sound of accountability taking hold. Karen was humiliated, arrested, and stripped of any semblance of power. Her live stream had gone viral, her ramp had collapsed spectacularly, and the proof of her attempted bribery was undeniable. Each action she had taken to assert dominance over her environment only served to document her downfall. Authorities used the videos, eyewitness testimony, and city reports to build an airtight case, leaving no room for negotiation or manipulation. Even after the legal proceedings began, her neighbors felt the ripple effects. The HOA, previously a playground for her authoritarian whims, was restructured. Rules were rewritten. Checks and balances were enforced. The culture of fear she had instilled evaporated, replaced by cautious cooperation and respect for boundaries. Residents began to document meetings, maintain records, and understand the limits of their rights, inspired by the spectacle that had unfolded before them. By the time her case reached the courthouse, Karen's narrative had shifted from local influencer to cautionary tale. News articles highlighted not just her arrest, but the larger story: how one person's arrogance, disregard for rules, and attempt to manipulate authority could trigger a domino effect impacting an entire community. Ridgefield Glen became a case study in authority gone unchecked and the power of legal enforcement to restore order. In the aftermath, quiet returned. Mail carriers delivered without fear of interference. Landscapers worked uninterrupted, and neighbors spoke openly about events that had once been whispered. Karen's name became synonymous with a cautionary lesson: the more aggressively you attempt to control others, the faster your own foundation crumbles. Her arrest and the HOA's receivership were not merely punitive, they were corrective, ensuring that the community could recover and prevent future abuses of authority. For Ridgefield Glen, life slowly normalized. Snow that had once been a tool of intimidation had, in the end, symbolized justice. The 12-foot wall that had trapped her cars became a memory, a monument to consequences and public oversight. Karen had wielded power recklessly, tried to bend rules to her favor, and ultimately collapsed under the weight of her own actions. Her meltdown was complete, her arrest public, her consequences absolute, and in the quiet streets of Ridgefield Glen, residents finally exhaled, reassured that justice, process, and patience could outlast arrogance, intimidation, and the fleeting illusion of control. Authority had been challenged, abused, and corrected, and the neighborhood had won, not through conflict, but through law, procedure, and the unstoppable weight of consequences. Spring arrived slowly that year. The last patches of snow receded. revealing green shoots pushing through frozen ground. Gradually, the neighborhood exhaled. The quiet returned. Mailboxes stood upright. Sidewalks were clear. Even the old drainage easement behind my house, once a battleground of icy chaos, became a peaceful greenway, protected and thriving. I didn't win because I yelled louder. I didn't win because I intimidated or outshouted anyone. I won because I documented everything, learned the law, and exercised patience. Every HOA letter, every trespass notice, every overreach was recorded, stored, and leveraged. That is how authority collapses, not by confrontation, but by facts, procedure, and timing. Us like Karens depend on people backing down, on silence, on fear. When someone refuses to play that game, the illusion of power shatters. Today, my business is thriving again. The neighborhood is calm. My property is respected. The snow wall that once towered over the driveway is gone, melted and removed, but the lesson remains. Unchecked power always overreaches, and overreach leaves evidence. Every action has a consequence. Every abuse of authority can be traced, documented, and challenged. Ridgefield Glen learned it firsthand, and so did I. Authority is fragile when it relies on intimidation, and resilient when met with preparation and knowledge. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button on HOA Gone Wild. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? Your story might be next.